In this video, you're going to put together everything you've learned about JSX and ES6 classes to create your very first React components. We're going to explore the fundamentals of creating a React component, and we're going to get our first components rendered to the screen. So to kick things off, what we're going to do is empty app.js. Right here, we have the JSX version of our application with no components in place. We're going to go ahead and build this up with components instead, so we can take all of this code and cut it out. I am going to paste it over in another file though, so we have it as a reference for the future. We can just create a new file in the playground folder for that. I'm going to call this one JSX indecision.js. In here, I'll dump all of that code, and that's going to allow us to build up from scratch, looking at React components without worrying about all of the overhead of existing code. Now, the last thing to do before we create our first React component is to switch up our command over in the terminal. Currently, Babel is running that ES6 classes file. That's the file in the playground folder. We're going to switch it up to run app.js. That is the file in the source folder. Excellent. Let's head over to the browser and make sure nothing shows up. There we go. We have nothing showing up. Let's go ahead and create our very first React component. As you probably guessed, a React component is just an ES6 class, so that is exactly where we're going to start. We're going to make a brand new class for our brand new component. The first component we're going to build out is the header component with our title and subtitle. A good name for that would be something like header. From here, we can open and close our curly braces, and there we have it, a perfectly valid ES6 class. Now, at this point, our class has none of the special behavior of React. The goal is to not write all that behavior, otherwise we wouldn't be using React. The goal is to take header and convert it from an ES6 class to a component by extending something that React gives us. So right here, we're going to use extends. Now, we already explored that there are two globals we get from our two script tags. We get a global React and a global React DOM. Right here, we're going to be using the global React, uppercase R. Then we can go ahead and access a value on that object that is uppercase C component. Component is a class itself. So we're taking header and we're extending this. That gives us all of the features of React. Now that header is a React component, there's one thing we got to know about React components. React components require one method to be defined. This is a special method that it calls, that is render. So with ES6 classes, we can have no methods defined. That's perfectly valid. We saw that in the last two videos. With React components, you must define render. Right here, render gets called with no arguments, and it returns some JSX. So if I'm going to render header at the top of my page, I return all of the JSX that I want to show up. In our case, we can just return a little paragraph tag to start with. This is from header. Excellent. We can close that p tag, toss a semicolon on the end, and there we have it, a perfectly valid React component. Let's go ahead and actually get this guy rendered to the screen. As always, to render, we are going to be using React DOM.render. That is the standard method, whether you're using regular JSX or React components. And from here, we go ahead and we render some stuff to the screen. So we're going to make a JSX variable in a second. Then we're going to go ahead and define where we want to put all of that stuff right here. Document.getElement by ID. And then we're going to go ahead and get our div by ID. We gave it an ID of app. So let's take just 5 seconds to create that JSX, a const JSX. We'll set up our parentheses for formatting purposes only, and then we'll make a root div inside of here. Inside of that root div, we know we can put all sorts of cool stuff. In the past, we had title tags, links, lists, all sorts of great items. For a moment, let's just create an H1, and we'll give this one a text value of title. Now, the goal is to not define all of the elements in JSX. That's what we were doing in the past. The goal is to compose this page using all of the React components we've already created. Now, in order to render a React component, we actually create what looks like a custom HTML element. Instead of using h1 or div, though, we use our class name. That means right here, we are going to go ahead and use an uppercase H header right after the opening less than sign. We're then going to go ahead and close that off, and there we have it. We now have a React component getting rendered. If we go ahead and save app.js, not only should we see the title, we should also see our paragraph coming from the header component, and that is indeed showing up. Now, React components are fantastic because they are reusable. So I can take this one little guy. I can paste it 2 more times, and now I have 3 instances of the exact same component without needing to write all of the code 3 times. Instead, I just use it wherever I want it. In this case, I use it 3 times back to back. If you remember back from the ES6 class videos, the last 2, I mentioned that the uppercase first letter is merely a convention and that a lowercase first letter is perfectly valid. Well, with React components, that's no longer the case. React enforces that uppercase first letter. If you have a lowercase first letter and you try to use that down here, it is not going to fail. It's just not going to render your component. The uppercase first letter is how React differentiates between an HTML element like lowercase d div and lowercase h1h and a React component. Here we have that uppercase first letter, so it does something special behind the scenes. Now we can explore that special thing by just looking at the final output. We have that over in the scripts folder. In public scripts app.js, we have the compiled version of this code. Now, a lot of the code added up top, this is not code we wrote. This is code that allows us to support features in older browsers, but down below we are going to start to see some code we wrote. Here we have something that looks like our header class, though clearly it is not the same, and down below we have some stuff that looks a little more similar. So we have our JSX variable, for example. Now we've already seen this output inside of the Babel REPL website. We have our div, and the div has some children, the first one being an h1. And with our HTML elements, we know that the first argument to React.createElement is a string. So here it's the string div, here it is the string h1. But for components, we can see that the first argument is actually the class reference itself. So it is not in strings, it is literally referencing the header class that we just created up above. If I were to change one of these over to a lowercase h and save the program, we can see that this time we just get 2 instances of header. And if I go over here, we can see it now converted it to a string and is trying to create the header HTML element, which actually does indeed exist. So this uppercase convention is really important. It's what allows React to figure out if the thing we're trying to render is a component or an HTML element. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and create a couple more React components. We're going to go ahead and do one more together, then we'll have you create a few on your own. The next class we'll be building will be action. That is going to be where our big old button sits. That is the class action. It's going to be a React component, so we have to have that uppercase first letter. From here, we are going to use extends to extend React.component. That gives us all of the behavior of a React component without actually writing any of the code. And we know that React components have to define render. So right here, we will put that. Excellent. Now inside of render, all we know for now is that we need to return some JSX. And in the past, we returned a single element like the paragraph tag, but we can also use the technique we used down below. I could add some parentheses, I could create a root div, and then I could dump as much stuff in that div as I wanted to. For our case, we just need a single button. And we can set up the button text. What should I do? We close the button text and there we go. Now we're not going to talk about event handlers just yet. That's a slightly more complex topic. It involves more React component related features. We'll explore those in subsequent videos. For now, we're going to stick with the static component. And we're going to do something similar for header too. Right here, we can remove this paragraph tag. I can set up my parentheses. I can create a root div, allowing me to add other elements side by side. And in our case, we're going to set up an h1 and an h2. The h1 will be our title tag, and the h2 can be our subtitle. For the h1, we'll use the text we've been using so far, indecision. And for the h2, we can go ahead and add our subtitle. Put your life in the hands of a computer. Perfect. Now that we have that in place, let's go ahead and actually use action. Currently, we just render header 3 times. In order to use action, we will create our custom looking HTML element. We provide the name, we close it off, and there we go. Now tossing a space between the / and the last letter of the component class, that is just optional. This is also perfectly valid, but it's a common spacing convention to keep a space in there. If we save app.js, we should see an instance of header and an instance of action, and that is exactly what we're getting. At this point, we can remove our other h1. It's no longer necessary. And now all of the rendered output we're seeing on the screen, it's all coming from React components. Now, we're not quite done yet. We're going to go ahead and create 2 more, and both of those are going to be your challenge for the video. The first one that you're going to be making should be a class, and we're going to call this one Options. The Options class will eventually contain a list of all of the current available options. And for the moment, you can just have this one render some static text like we've been doing with these guys. You can just say something like options component here. We'll worry about the details later, and then you're just going to render that right below action. The other component you're going to be creating is going to be the add option component. This is where we are going to have our form. The form is going to allow the user to go ahead and actually type some text in and submit it. And once again, no need to wire any of that up. Events work a little bit differently inside of React components, so we're going to explore that in just a couple of videos. For now, once again, static text works. Add option component here, and that'll get rendered down below where the options component gets rendered. So take some time to knock out those 2 static components, then go ahead and render both of them, making sure the text shows up in the browser. When you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, that one shouldn't have been too bad. We're going to go ahead and make both of these components, and we're going to get them both rendered to the screen. For now, they're very basic ones. Static text gets the job done. Class, options. This is going to extend using extends, react.component, something we're going to be doing dozens of times throughout the course. Then we define the one thing we have to define, which is the render method. Render takes no arguments, and it returns the JSX we want to show to the screen. In our case, I mentioned that static text was fine. I'm going to return, in parentheses, a div. And inside of that div, I'll just dump my text. It's okay if you formatted things a little bit differently. Options, component here. I'll toss a semicolon on the end, and there we have it. That is all we need to do for options. Let's go ahead and get that one rendered to the screen before continuing on. We're going to render options, save the file, and see what happens. Right here, we got options component here showing up. So that is component 1 of 2 done. Let's move on to the other guy, the add option component. Add option is going to sit right down below, class, add option. Like all of our components, we don't want to build out the rendering behavior. This comes from React. It's the whole reason we're using it. So we're going to extend react.component. Inside of here, we'll define the one thing we have to define. We're going to define render, and we're going to return our JSX. Like we've done before, I always like to set up that root div with the parentheses because most of your components are going to have a tiny bit of complexity, and this just makes life a whole lot easier. So I'll usually always start off with this. Is it necessary for this case? No, but this is just dummy text. We're going to be building out the component. It's a good habit to get into. Right inside of here, what do we want? Static text is fine. Add option component here. Let's go ahead and render it. If it shows up, we are all done. Add option component with an uppercase first letter. I'm going to remove the comments, save the file, and cross my fingers. What are we getting in the browser? We are getting both of our messages showing up. Options component here and add option component here. Both of those are only showing up because we created our custom classes, our React components, and then we used them down below to get them rendered to the screen. Now, we covered a whole bunch in this video. Let's take just a quick moment to recap. What did we learn? We learned that React components, they're just ES6 classes that extend something React gives us. We also learned that they have to have an uppercase first letter, and they have to define a render method. So this is a pretty bare bones component. This is basically as simple as it gets. Now, in order to use these components, we just provide them inside of some JSX. This looks like how we would create an HTML element, but since we do have that uppercase first letter, it actually uses our class. In this case, it's using header right here. Wherever we put this, we will have all of the content of header. If I add this multiple times, I will see that content multiple times. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can do some more interesting things with components like nest our components. That is the topic of the next video, so stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.